Hello YouTube, back again with another reaction video. Today I'm going to be reacting to two of really some of my favorite thinkers in the world today, Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke. They're both based out of Canada. Jordan Peterson is a psychological thinker. He used to be a psychology professor and a psychologist. And John Vervaeke is, I believe, in more neuroscience, more the biological and whatnot end of the psychological spectrum, but he's also deeply schooled in philosophy. These two people are incredibly deep thinkers, and today they're talking about, I believe, religion and neuroscience, which are two topics that are dear to my heart. So I'm going to be reacting. I've only seen a little bit of this. I'm going to be reacting to some of it and sharing my perspective, again, as somebody who is a polytheist. So here we go.
Speaking, let's turn a bit from the practical to the intellectual. I've got an idea about the sacred I want to run by you.
Sure.
Technically. Well, imagine that you have a hierarchy of thinkers such that this would exist over time,
Okay.
such that some thinkers have more thinkers dependent on them than other thinkers.
Sure.
Right? So they're more seminal. Right? You'd get a rough approximation of that with citation counts in the scientific endeavor. And citation counts are a pretty good index of quality as well as quantity, at least compared to every other index that we have. So you can imagine a dependency structure among thinkers, so that obviously a thinker like Milton would be of primary depth, and Shakespeare, the people who are part of the canon. And so rather than conceptualizing the canon as a consequence of the arbitrary decisions of arbiters of taste, let's say, you could say that the canon is the consequence of the cumulative impact of a thinker's thoughts moving forward. And some thinkers are more key than others. My sense, for example, and there's historical reasons for this, obviously, that the biblical corpus stands at the bottom of the Western canon, and then there are thinkers who have their feet placed firmly in that tradition: Dante, Milton, Shakespeare, etc., and then a branching structure above all that.
Well, there's a couple places I could go with this. So I think he's right that some ideas are more dependent or have more dependencies than other ideas. I think he's putting a little too much emphasis on the concept of, popularity. Essentially, there's an assumption he's making that because something, you see the same thing in the scientific literature that he alluded to, is, I've done a video on this, one of the first videos on my channel, the citation problem, where you basically get a series of accumulating errors in scientific literature because it's essentially books or papers based on papers based on papers based on papers. So you follow a chain, and if people were perfectly rational, then that chain would point to truth. It would compound in the direction of truth. But since people are not perfectly rational and they can only focus on so much at a time, what tends to happen is the the function of a chain of literary dependencies or narrative dependencies point in the direction that serves life. So it doesn't necessarily point towards truth, because truth does not necessarily serve life. So something being true is independent of whether somebody remembers it. And also, these things, basically the falsehoods can be reinforced just as easily as the truths. So if you wanted to understand the corpus of texts that are dependent on, let's say, the Bible, you would actually have to go outside of the Bible and lodge it inside of a a concept that's geometric in nature that is not dependent on something man-made. You would have to lodge it inside of a structure that is able to take in all meta-narratives and rank order them accordingly by some principle. So, and you can do that with scientific thinking too. Like, for instance, you can cross-reference physics, engineering, biochemistry, and computer science and figure out where they contradict each other and dig into those contradictions and find more, get closer to truth, presumably by comparing and contrasting various trees of dependent ideas. But so far, this is really interesting stuff.
Okay, so it's a matter of dependency. And so how fundamental a given thought is dependent on how many other thoughts are dependent on it for its validity. Okay, now this works out neuropsychologically too. So imagine that you have Janoff Bowman, who talked about trauma as a theory that's analogous to this, and I think it fits in well with the entropy control theories of Friston. So then imagine that your perceptions and therefore your emotional regulation are dependent upon a nested sequence of assumptions. And a given phenomenon can violate an assumption, and the degree of entropy that's produced by the assumption violation is proportionate to the depth of the assumption. Right. So
that, by the way, is why these systems of nested ideas, why they don't necessarily serve truth, because they're created by people who are trying to minimize entropy. So a system that minimizes entropy and a system that accurately depicts reality there's no rule that says that those two things should be the same. So, for instance, if these systems were designed by somebody trying to find truth, then you would expect them to be an accurate reflection of reality. But since he's just said that these systems are built by people trying to avoid trauma and reduce entropy, you would expect them to coalesce in a simpler and simpler direction. So I think that's going to be important later, so keep an eye on that.
Janoff Bowman talks about, for example, her model of trauma is shattered assumption, the deeper the assumption. So, for example, one way you can be traumatized in a marital relationship is through the discovery of infidelity.
Yeah.
Right.
Your hyperpriors get destroyed.
Yeah, so what do you call them?
Hyperpriors. In the Bayesian brain framework, in Friston's framework, the sort of priors that you use to run any of the Bayesian approximation. I actually don't like using the Bayesian math because you don't actually run the math. You run a dynamical system approximation, but that's how they talk about it in the literature. These are sort of your most these are the things that are applied in your predictive modeling in the most context invariant manner. So they apply.
Yeah, right. Context invariant. Right. Yeah. Well, that's another way of thinking about it too. Is that something more fundamental applies across more situations and time spans. Right. Okay. So here's a secondary consequence of that, I think. So then imagine that the degree to which you can handle entropy emerging as a consequence of the violation of your assumptions is proportionate to your social status. Okay, and the reason for that is that the better your reputation, and therefore the better your situation in the social environment happens to be, the more resources you can bring to bear on a problem if one emerges. Okay, now imagine your serotonin system indexes that, because we know serotonin is one of the systems that's implicated in the relationship between social status and emotional regulation.
Sure.
So now the serotonin system has inputs into the memory systems that have this hyperdependency structure, and they're a tuner, and so that you imagine disruption would be characterized in terms of its estimated magnitude by the depth of the presumption that was being violated.
Sure.
And then there's a control mechanism off to the side of that, such that the more tenuous your grip on the social environment is, the higher the level of negative emotion that's produced in relationship to the violation of a given level of assumption.
Whew, really good stuff. I would say that this is the way that an unreflective mind interacts with the juxtaposition of truth and the social environment. So what he's describing is true for many people. Interestingly, even though I don't think me and him have different we put the Christian doctrine in different levels of importance. I don't think the Christian doctrine is the root of the Western canon. I think it's obviously an important step in the Western canon, but it is a step that I think took the Western canon away from complexity and sort of an alchemical coagulation. But this being said, what he just said about the social status thing is one of the best antidotes to letting your grip on truth be dependent on your social status is actually found in the Sermon on the Mount, because I believe Jesus said something to the effect of, you'll always have enough if you keep your eyes on the day and aim up. Something to that effect. I believe he couched it in more theological terms. Praise God and focus on the day. The troubles of the day are sufficient. That kind of thing. So there's a formula. It's a formula to rewire your serotonin system. Because as he said, the reason that you care about social status isn't because of social status. It's because of caloric intake and the caloric, your access to energy, and because changing your ideas, your axioms, your core axioms takes energy. And what Jesus basically said, and you could find versions of this in the Tao Te Ching very explicitly, not Tao Te Ching, I Ching, commentaries on the I Ching from China from around the same period, actually predating Jesus. You can find the same concepts. Is that if you actually focus on the process of transformation, you are not going to die of starvation or be naked in the streets. You will have your basic needs met if you do that. And that kind of thing is what fuels monks, fuels monastic life, and keeps them alive. So it's an experiment, and it requires you to do the experiment with your life in order to gratify it. And I can't recommend that, but I also can't not recommend it. So the Sermon on the Mount, I've often thought, is a way for you to rewire your relationship with social status so you can exist in a continual state of axiom redefinition.
Sure.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense to you. That seems to be
far,
reasonable.
very clear, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, so then I've been working. Well, I'm writing, as I mentioned, a book on explication of biblical narrative. It's called We Who Wrestle with God, and I've been working.
Oh, nice pun on Israel.
Yes, right, exactly. And I discovered that relationship when I did the lectures on Genesis in 2017. So I've been trying to come up with a technical definition of the sacred, right? And this is relevant to research on awe too. So the deeper you go, the closer you get to the sacred. And I'm speaking as a matter of definition here. So as you move down your assumption hierarchy and you get to these, you call them hyper-priors.
Yeah.
The closer you get to the ultimate hyper-prior, the more you're walking on sacred ground. And that's a technical definition. Now, if you encounter something that shifts you in a hyper-prior, and that's a positive encounter, that's going to produce a corresponding sensation of awe. Right, and that I would say that's probably a dopaminergically mediated revelation of possibility. So let me run something else by you and tell me what you think about this. Okay, so I've been conceptualizing the sacred as a process too. So there's a spirit in the Old Testament that's characterized as Yahweh, and the theory in the corpus is that whatever this central spirit is makes itself manifest in a number of different guises. So for Noah, for example, God is the spirit that calls the wise to prepare when the flood is coming. And for Abraham, God is the call of the spirit of adventure. And so you see these juxtapositions of narratives that shed a different light on this central spirit with each story, united by the claim that regardless of the surface differences of the manifestation of this spirit, it's reflecting an underlying unity. That's...
So it's effectively, it's making the claim that that's an underlying unity. The problem with that is that the underlying unity is being alluded to by paradox, which points to it being divisible into pieces, which means that it's not an underlying. The only unity is post hoc rationalization. So that's not much of a unity. But for the sake of argument, let's say that sure, we will assume that that's a group. I would say a group is a better terminology than a unity, or a family, perhaps, but we shall see.
It's the monotheistic hypothesis, one God underneath all the gods. So a dependency structure that has a fundamental base or a pinnacle, depending on which set of metaphors that you use. So when I wrote Maps of Meaning, I had started to conceptualize the call of the sacred as something like spontaneous interest, right? Is that, well, so things will grip your attention and compel you in a certain direction. I realized later, after I wrote that book, many years later, that that was equivalent to the more traditional notion of calling. And then I think I missed something in Maps of Meaning that's half of the divine, because I really concentrated on interest, and that was sort of under the influence of humanistic psychologists who were oriented towards, say, self-actualization. But there's a corresponding element of conscience. And so there are conceptualizations by Cardinal Newman, for example, of God as the internalized voice of conscience, right? Like the source of the superego. That's another way of thinking about it. But then you could think of Yahweh as sort of the dynamic relationship between calling and conscience. And to me, that maps nicely onto positive and negative emotion.
What he's describing, I consider as the juxtaposition or the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn. Saturn punishes you for a violation of natural law. Jupiter calls you towards growth. The reason that I like that representation is that Jupiter and Saturn each have their own excesses. Saturn's excess is authoritarianism. Jupiter's excess is either zealotry or excessive optimism, blinding optimism, being pulled in so many different directions that you actually miss the point. So that is, but I would say that that's a relationship between two indivisible forces rather than a manifestation of a monotheistic unity. It's best conceptualized as a relationship between two conflicting entities in sort of a Hegelian dialectic.
Because a calling is going to entice you forward with dopaminergically mediated, what would you say, indications of treasure to come. And conscience is going to say, you've deviated off the golden path into the domain of danger, and there's something you should sort out. And then, well, you see quite clearly in the Old Testament corpus, and it also emerges in the New Testament, that there's a dynamic relationship between conscience and calling. And that looks to me like what's conceptualized as the Holy Spirit, that dynamic relationship.
I mean, my definition of spirit doesn't really encapsulate a relationship necessarily. There's a relationship between two spirits. You could... The issue that I have with the idea that it's a unity is that the relationship between those two spirits manifests differently for every person. So it can't actually be seen to be a unity. There's an archetypal struggle inside of every person that goes back and forth in a dialogical way, and it's a sort of opposition between two forces. But the difference is mostly trivial. It's in the technical details. The net result is the same. It's just a technical issue that I have with that. So sure, why not?
So,
wow, that's a lot.
Well, I've been working on this for months, So yeah, so
interesting, because I've been working on this sacred a lot too.
Starting
my thoughts.
Yeah.
And I'll share where I think they intersect with yours, but maybe they differ. But I think in a fruitful way. First of all, there's sort of, in the literature I've been reading, there's sort of three dimensions that are usually talked about with respect to the sacred. One is ultimacy, which I think you articulated. And the move you made, and this is a compliment to you, by the way, is the classic move of Neoplatonism, which is called asymmetric dependence. So what is everything asymmetrically dependent on? That's how you get your ultimate. What is that in terms of which everything else is explained and understood?
Right.
That's ultimacy. And then two other dimensions of the sacred, which I think you're alluding to. One is axiological, that you love this ultimate. It isn't just an
Right.
intellectual grasp for you.
So that's the directionality.
Yes, and there's a valuing, there's a loving, but the reason why I want to say love rather than just value is love doesn't carry with it necessarily the egocentrism of value, which can be very egocentrically oriented.
Right.
So love is
So would that be, maybe that would be expressed in the Old Testament corpus as part of the covenantal relationship, because
I think
it's a
so.
personal relationship rather than a what would you say, instrumental relationship.
Yeah, Esther Lekep-Meek argues that in her covenantal epistemology and loving to know, and how there's this deep bond between knowing God and loving God, that you can't separate them.
Right.
And so that's
conceptualized metaphorically in the guise of a relationship, rather than as having something.
Oh, yes, it's very much about being in relationship, and that's why I want to use the word love. You can have preferences or even values, but you have to be in love. It's a commitment of the whole self.
I would say that is part of the reason why I started doing reaction videos, because I realized that through a dialogical contrast of opposing viewpoints, I could shed my perspective more effectively. It's one thing to talk in front of a camera and have limited engagement. It's another thing to listen to other people speak and then give my feedback. It provides more context. But I think that this tension of opposites pointing toward truth is something that I'm very keen on. So, and that it implies that there is not a unity, right? Because if we were a unity, we would have nothing to talk about. But the fact that we are separate beings engaging in this dialogue, I think points towards something profound.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the thing about love is it gets you on Plato's pivot point. It involves the whole of the self without being self-involved,
Right.
which seems to be another dimension of this calling. The sacred doesn't just call your aesthetic interest or your ethical interest or your intellect. It calls you as a complete person. This is one of the things that Tillich emphasized.
Speaks to the image of God within.
Yes, and you know, the Christian tradition of the transmutation of the image into the likeness. And so I think that's the axiological dimension. And then there's the soteriological dimension, that this loving relationship to what is ultimate is transformative, it's healing, it's redemptive, it's liberating. And so the reason why this is important is, of course, is this allows the sacred to be found in things that are in non-theistic traditions like Buddhism, the Tao, right? Things like that. So the first part of what you were talking about, like I said, and again, I think this speaks well of it, is it aligns with the classic Neoplatonic proposal of that what we're trying to get in touch with what is most real,
Yep.
we have to get to the ground of intelligibility through looking at asymmetric dependence.
Yep,
So this
yep.
is the notion of the ultimate, the one.
Asymmetrical dependence. Is that the terminology that's used?
Yeah, Kevin Corrigan uses that when he tries to talk about how Plotinus makes his argument for the one, the ultimate reality within the Neoplatonic system, which gets
Yep.
taken up.
Well, one of the ways of sorting through that, as far as I'm concerned, is to note that there's either a unity or there's a plurality, and then to note what the consequences of those are. If there's a plurality, there's inbuilt contradictions in the structure of being and becoming itself, and there's divisiveness that can't be overcome. If there's an ultimate unity, it might be mysterious and ineffable, but it does indicate that all things can be brought together in some sort of harmonious relationship. And that's relevant to human motivation, because if there's a plurality, there's going to be confusion and anxiety, because confusion and anxiety mark a plurality. So
I think the terminology he's meaning to use there is a chaotic plurality or a random plurality, and an unpatterned reality. So there are plainly contradictions in the grounds of being, in the same way that every point on a circle contradicts its opposing point, but it's still a circle. So the idea that that you have this inherent tension that's marked by a group of spirits that all have relationships to each other. The unity is in the relationship between the various spirits and manifestations. another way of thinking about it is that you have a tension with your family. There are contradictions in your family in that you might be one thing, you are one thing, your parents are another thing, your grandparents are another thing, your ancestors are another thing, your siblings are another thing. They're all contradictory in that they're not congruent, but there's still a group that's brought together in a relationship. Now, every single person is also a fractal image of that. So you have different pieces within you, and they're in contradiction. They are in contradiction by definition. Everybody's experience shows them that. But they are in relationship. They are in a familial relationship. So it's not that there's one spirit in everybody. It's that there is a nested sequence of spiritual processes that can either be in a familial relationship or a combative relationship. And you have to sort of integrate. Integration is the process of turning these discordant or reconciling the contradictions within yourself. That's what the nature of an internal sorting out your internal dialogue is.
Well, yeah, this is Kierkegaard's purity of heart is to will one thing.
Right.
And so, but this again is a Neoplatonic argument. The idea is whenever we're understanding something, what we're doing is taking two things and finding a unifying principle. And then if you were to pursue understanding to its depths, you'd get something that technically speaking can't be understood because it is the principle by which all understanding.
Everything is understood.
Right. So what you'll get is
so it grounds out ineffability.
It grounds out ineffability, and if you look at like Nicholas of Cusa, where it grounds out in sort of the paradoxical realization that what we consider ultimate polarities, are actually somehow stereoscopically transcended. So, for example, even though the term is the one, it is understood as being beyond singularity and plurality. It is neither singular nor plural.
The ultimate ground of being is a relationship between parts, and then each of those parts, you cannot understand them because there's nowhere to understand them from. So yes, I agree with that.
Because it is the basis for that particular kind of intelligibility. It is transcentric. God is an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere.
Is that Nicholas of Cusa?
Well, it was taken up by Nicholas and others, but it was actually...
That's a great line.
Yeah, and well, Nicholas has one that goes with it, that God is within everything but not enclosed, and beyond everything but not excluded. Right. And so that's ultimacy. And then the idea is, and this comes from Yaden's work and some of my own work, when people come into relationship to that which they consider more real, they're really real, they take on this loving relationship in that they seek to transform their identities and their lives.
You suppose that's a marker for the validity of the encounter? Like, well, if you stumble across something that entices you into a relationship of love, is that actually a reliable ontological marker, let's say?
Well, I think if two things line up, yes. I think the answer is yes. I think that's an excellent question. I think if you get the reciprocal opening that's found in love, for example, I have a wonderful partner, and I've come to understand that there's something about her that will always be beyond my grasp, and I open up to that, and she opens up to that in me, and we reciprocally open. And Aaron, that's how you fall in love with something.
Yeah.
So I think, and from the first person perspective, it's yes. But I think Yaden and other people have done work that when people have this sense of being called and they have this noetic experience of the really real, they do make their lives better by many objective measures. Their relationships get better.
Well, you mentioned healing.
Yeah.
So
that's
I've been wrestling about that physiologically. Well, partly because I've been writing about the Gospels, and about a quarter to a third of the Gospel account is miracles of healing, right? Which is difficult ground to tread on if you're an empirical materialist, let's say, if you're
or
a
at least
scientist.
a naturalist.
Exactly. But there's another frame of interpretation which doesn't necessarily exclude the miraculous, but at least sidesteps it for the moment, possibly, or brings them together, to suggest that, well, if the pattern of being that Christ represents is a divine ideal, there's every reason to assume that it would be allied with the kind of healing that you were describing, so imagine that you could embody a spirit, a set of practices, a set of perceptions and emotions that would optimize your function in relationship to the transcendent, there's every reason to assume that what would accompany that would be an optimization of psychophysiological function. I mean,
that essentially is the practice of therapy. Therapy is it's the magical concept that if you meet with somebody and you tell them the truth about your past and maybe possibilities of your future, that will actually make you physically and mentally healthier. So therapy is probably the best way, aside from psychedelics, to get people to quit smoking, get people to stop being alcoholics, get people to do all this stuff. And it's been said that psychedelics are essentially just accelerated psychotherapy, which is funny because one of the most common, the two most common things that psychedelics do, the experiences that psychedelics engender, are talking to either some sort of essentially angelic entities, or talking to nature, something to that effect, talking to something much bigger than yourself, and also questioning your belief systems, so questioning your axioms. I've heard it said that in psychedelics, when you're taking psychedelics, it doesn't matter whether you're an uncontacted Amazonian tribesman or a, New York astrophysicist, graduated from Harvard or something, you will come to realize that the world you thought you had is not the world that is. So, weirdly, psychedelics seem to cure, and therapy by extension, given that psychedelics are essentially just a dose of 10 years of psychotherapy, they effectively are a cure for both dogma and cigarettes. So that's interesting.
That's no different than claiming that you're going to have a much higher risk for mortality if you're depressed, which is well known, right? So there are links between attitude and underlying thriving that are well established, and it's not unreasonable to point out that, like, the archetypal ideal that manifestation of the archetypal ideal, or even contact with the archetypal ideal, would be something that would tap you hard in a healing direction.
One of the great disservices that I think the Judeo-Christian text has done is by making that ideal, in a form of cosmic nepotism, unattainable to mere mortals. Because if the ideal is unattainable, then you can't actually, you can't attain it. Therefore, you can't have access to the full healing power of it. So that's why I'm actually, in some ways, opposed to monotheism, because you can't actually get anywhere near monotheism because of the divine hierarchy imposed by it. But if you get out of that divine hierarchy, then yeah, you can actually approach the sacred in a much more free and open direction. I understand why some people might not like that idea. You can also get in touch with some really dark shit that way. But, there's no risk without reward.
I think so. I mean, one of the arguments I've been working on is, well, you know this better than I do. I mean, one of Piaget's great insights, the thing that made him a brilliant scientist, right, is he was looking for systematicity in the error being produced in the psychometric measures of intelligence. Just that move alone is brilliant. Everybody else treats the errors as noise. He says, well, what if there's patterns in the error, and if there's systematicity that points to intrinsic constraints and developmental arc and all that, and that alone is brilliant. And then I've sort of been reflecting on that and connecting with some of the literature in insight, which is to think, well, if there's systematicity of error, there's also the possibility of systematicity of insight, which is not an insight into this particular problem, but an insight into a family or network of problems, such that, right, it would lead to a systematic transformation of one's orientation and grip on the world. And it would also be systemic. It would tend to percolate through the entire psyche.
That's what a baptism is.
Well, I mean, it can be. I mean...
right. That's the transformation that a baptism is designed to bring about, if it's possible.
Yeah.
It's also the transformation that ritual magic, which a baptism is designed to bring about. The issue I have with the baptism is the same issue I have with monotheism, is that it indoctrinates you into an impossible and paradoxical tradition. where you can't actually attain the pinnacle because the pinnacle has actually already been attained by the boss's son and he's gatekeeping. So there's that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the shamanic death and rebirth.
Yep, 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 absolutely.
I think the great doubt in Zazen is doing it.
Yeah.
And you know.
Well, that's what happened to Descartes too.
How so? How do you think?
Well, he decided that he was going to doubt everything, right, and to take a journey down to what would you say, the land of the fundamental presumption, something like that. And my sense with Descartes, and it's his realization is often translated as "I think, therefore I am," but I don't really think that that's how he would have conceptualized it had he been alive now. I think it's something more like "I'm conscious, therefore I am," or "I can't doubt the fundamental reality of my own being."
I'll put it back to you in the way I see it. And let's say before the scientific revolution in Descartes, we have a contact epistemology. We have the epistemology that when you know something, the form of that, not the shape, the form of it, the principle of intelligibility in it is identical in your mind and the thing. They conform together. So this is a contact epistemology. It's a mutual participation. And then, of course, when we get this, because of Copernicus and Kepler, we get this separation of the divorce. I talk about this a lot in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And what Descartes does is he tries to find where there's still that contact, and where he finds it remaining is in self-consciousness. The mind's contact with itself is where that knowing by being is still to be found. And he withdraws. The problem we have faced since that is you can't get contact with the world from that contact of the mind with itself. And so this is what a lot of the work I'm engaged in is about trying to overcome. What's interesting is that Descartes, unbeknownst to a lot of people, of course, Descartes puts a lot of emphasis on logic. But Descartes also puts quite a bit of emphasis on insight. That moment of insight where you get the flash, and so all of the premises of the argument hang together, that's crucial.
Well, okay, I want to go a couple of directions from all that. I've been thinking about thought itself as a form of secularized prayer. Okay, so let me. Okay, so let me lay out what I've been thinking, and tell me what you've been thinking and what you think about this. So, the first issue is that we say we think things up, but we have no idea what that means, because the phenomenology. This is something, by the way, that Carl Jung cottoned me onto to some degree. He said that we come across our own thoughts like we come across the furniture in a room. It's like they're laid out before us, and that always struck me, because being struck by a thought or having a thought appear in your internal landscape is, well, I think it's a revelation. I don't think it's any different than a revelation. So here's the steps, as far as I can tell, of thought. The first step is something like a confession. And the confession is, whatever I think about this is insufficient, which is equivalent in part to thinking I'm insufficient, right? So it's a humble step. I have to not know something, and that not knowing has to be of motivational significance. And then that has to be allied with wanting to know. Okay, and that has to be allied with faith that knowing would be better than ignorance. And that's a presumption, man, especially because lots of times when you get a revelatory thought, you're going to pay a price for your knowledge, which might be the catastrophic dissolution of some of your previous assumptions, right? So you have to have this axiomatic presumption that more knowledge is good in the ways that would be desirable to you, and even more generally. And I think that's something like faith in the essential goodness of being and its intelligibility itself. And I think that's partly why the scientific endeavor is embedded in that assumption of the goodness of being and the goodness of knowledge. Anyways.
No, I agree with that.
Okay. So with regards to...
I want to talk to you about that at some point.
Okay,
what I call extended naturalism.
Okay, we'll get back to that. So with regard to revelation, so the first is admission of insufficiency.
Yes.
And then there's the positing of a question. And that seems to me to be allied with this gospel insistence that if you knock, the door will open, and if you ask, you'll receive, and if you seek, you'll find. That all depends on actually asking, actually wanting to know, actually seeking. It can't be a game. You got to want to know. You know, one of the things I've noticed in my own life is, for example, if I'm having a problem communicating with my wife, or I'm having a scrap with a family member and there's a certain amount of pain in it, that if I sit down and I say, probably I'm contributing to something to this. I'd like to know what it is, which is not a fun thing to do.
No.
No, but you'll get an answer. Okay, so that's the next step. So you've got your humble confession. Then you've got your revelation, which is the appearance of a solution to that. Now, people say when they describe that they thought that up. But to me, that's an empty explanatory framework because, yeah, if you couldn't think it up, why didn't you know it to begin with? And what exactly did you do to think it up? And the answer is, well, I asked a question and a thought arose. It's something like that.
Yes, you're relating to the other, to the one of the calling and conscience that he talked about, that I referred to as the principles of Jupiter and Saturn. And those are other entities. They're irreducible. And when you enter into dialogue with them, they're going to produce a scale that effectively the mediation between those two entities, the dialogue between those two entities and you, is going to produce a process that gets you closer to something that will affect your relationships with other people. Those are called the social planets. Planet just means wanderers because for complicated reasons, it doesn't really matter. But the interesting thing about the framework of Jupiter and Saturn is that Jupiter is exalted in the sign of Cancer, which is the home, which is the loving relationship between family members, and it is debilitated or weakest in the sign of Capricorn, which is the opposite of Cancer. It's the work environment, your discipline, your duties, your job. So basically, you want to know for the love of knowing. You don't want to know for pragmatic effect. It's your ability to learn is actually weaker when you're doing it for pragmatic effect and stronger when you're doing it for the sake of love in the alchemical tradition. Now, Saturn, your conscience, your inner rule keeper, your inner disciplinarian, your inner principle, is exalted in the sign of Libra, which is the sign of selfless dialogue and peacemaking, and it's debilitated in the sign of Aries, which is your hero archetype, yourself. So what does this mean? It means that your conscience is best utilized in your relationships and your peacemaking with others, and that's exactly what he's talking about here. He's mixing the dialogical nature of Saturn, not trying to be right, trying to make peace with your conscience, and trying to create love with your knowledge. That's exactly what he's doing here.
And you can infer all sorts of unconscious mechanisms, but phenomenologically, the revelation appears and it strikes you, But that's not enough. That's not enough because you still then have the problem of potentially delusional or self-deceptive revelations.
Of course.
But then there's an insistence, a Judeo-Christian insistence in the case that I'm referring to, that you have to test the spirits to see if they're of God. So you have your confession and your openness to revelation. You have the receipt of the revelation, but then the next step is, well, you better put that thought to the test and, attack it from this side, test it out and see if it's got solidity and weight and to understand its implications. And it seems to me that, well, first of all, it seems to me that that's a variation of the practice of, it's a secularization of the practice of prayer. That's how it looks. I mean, that makes sense historically as well, but okay, so what do you think about that?
Before he responds, I want to say that the subjecting your thoughts to the test of solidity and architectural foundation is expressed in the dichotomy between the dialogue between Uranus and Neptune. Neptune is the thing he alluded to before that creates the flood, and Uranus is the thing he alluded to that allows you to prepare. Uranus was the divine architect of the cosmos in the Greek tradition, and Neptune is the god of the sea. And effectively, this is the best way I can summarize this is Uranus builds your house, Neptune checks your foundations and sees if they crumble under the weight of entropy and decay. And you can think of Neptune as delusion as well as water, because delusion, firstly, the word delusion is very clearly associated with the word deluge, which means flood. But the concept of delusion, if you are deluded about the solidity of your foundations, your foundations will be washed away regardless of what you think about. So that actually it gives materiality to the world. And in the alchemical tradition, Uranus is considered to be the aspect of Saturn. And Saturn is, again, the conscience that he's referring to. So what does that mean? It means that your conscience impels you to check your revelations and check against the delusions of revelation. And there's so much more I could get into on this, but this gets to the point for now.
First of all, I mean, notice that you were provoked in my mentioning of insight and the possibility of systemic insight.
Right. Yeah, because a deep revelation would be a systemic insight.
I think so. And there's a lot of work here. Part of what I'm doing on sabbatical is also going through all the last 5 years of the insight literature, trying to keep abreast of that. But yeah, so interesting, both in the Neoplatonic tradition and the Zen tradition, you'll get, like I do a practice every day where I'll say, who is asking the question?
Oh, yeah.
And then
there's a good question.
Yeah, and then who's listening to the answer?
Whether you're feeling...
Let me skip ahead on this.
And okay, when you get an answer to that, do you get a vision? Like,
no,
are you asking about like a form of possession, so to speak? Like, what set of motivations are positing this question, and what set of motivations are offering the answer?
No, see, that's the thing. I mean, I could, if I was doing sort of a phenomenological analysis for scientific reasons, and I do that. But in this practice, what I'm trying to do is to get at aporia, to get at genuinely not knowing, what Nicholas of Cusa called learned ignorance, which is what Socrates started with. He said, my wisdom consists in knowing what I do not know. I call it an aporetic aperture. What happens is you get a sense of, actually, I don't know who's listening. What'll happen is images will come up.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Right, but then when you go as, yes, and those are helpful images, but that is, I can just as easily ask what generated the image.
Yeah.
And what you get is, right, you get this falling away, and you get a very profound and frequently disturbing sense of actually deeply not knowing. But it's not a not knowing in the sense that you're disconnected from the depths, if I can use that language. It's a not knowing that precisely connects you deeper and deeper to the depths. And then
so do you think by doing that are you attempting to circumvent what might be regarded as narrowly self-serving biases in questioning or answering?
Yes.
And you're doing that by attempting to establish a relationship with what's ineffable at the base instead of stalling out, let's say, way down?
Yes, but it's nothing I can have. It's only something I can participate in. It's only something I can be. I can't have it, right? I can't ever... It's like James's distinction between the I and the me, which you're familiar with. I can never have the I. I can be I because I can only be aware of, I can only have the me. It's the same kind of thing. There's a no-thingness to it. But even saying no-thingness sounds like you're putting a name on an entity. What happens instead is a falling away of representational reification, of any attempt to reify things by representing them. And what you get is in a completely non-inflationary way, because I'm cognizant of who I'm talking to, you get that nothing is excluded, but nothing is enclosed within and without. And there is no within and without. You get to this, right?
So what's been the practical consequences of that practice for you?
Before he answers, I want to say that is essentially analogous to the Hindu concept of Ketu and Rahu. Rahu being it's represented by a head with no body, a chattering skull, and it is an illusion crafter. And that is it speaks to the fundamental illusory nature of our cognitive categories and how they're always insufficient. And then K2 is the one that is actually blind. But it's represented by embodied intelligence. It's represented by like a body with no head. So clear of all the categories and the mental chatter, just living in the body with no categories. It's represented in many times in martial arts movies because it's a more Eastern concept by the blind kung fu master. And I would say that there's so much I could get into here, but I would say that basically the entire concept of Zen is to embody that nature of that, or to understand and really act out the nature of the dichotomy, the relationship between K2 and Rahu, which are said to actually be one entity in the final analysis, paradoxically.
The practical consequences of that is a abiding sense that becomes more and more capable of intervening in my everyday consciousness and cognition of that epistemic and moral, at least that's what I believe is happening, what people are telling me, humility.
Yeah, well, when I saw you today and started talking to you, I thought three things. I thought you look more resigned, you look more hopeful, and you look more humble.
Well, thank you,
Jim. Yeah, well, I don't know what it is exactly. Well, your expression, maybe, and your voice tone, like, and I mean, it's not a dramatic shift from the last time I saw you, but it's a shift in the direction that you just described. And the resignation is interesting because I think that's a sign of faith and a sign of humility. You know, and it's not, people often think of resignation as pessimistic, but it doesn't, like.
I think of resolution. I use because of the double senses of the word, of coming properly into view, like when you resolve an image, but also I am resolved. I am being called to this pilgrimage on walking the philosophical Silk Road. This is my pilgrimage to the God beyond God. I am making myself as available as I possibly can
to that.
And
so okay. So I mean,
go ahead.
The philosophical Silk Road, it was something that he was interested in doing, where he's sort of physically maneuvering and making videos through the Eastern and Western old world, through Asia to understand the Tao, through the Middle East to understand the Semitic traditions, and through the West to understand the Western philosophers and try to understand them. And he's spanning this geographical region that I talk about, for instance, in my Piety and Liturgy video, and the symbolism of the culture war and sun gods, where I talk about the distinction between solar and Saturnian understandings and how that's reflected fractally in the concepts of East and West. But he's doing that, so he's actually embodying the Eastern and Western traditions and really trying to understand them, which I'm a big fan of. So it sounds like he's starting to reconcile these paradoxes, where you're not Eastern, you're not Western, you are man. So this is a very interesting concept here.
Oh, well, I mean, we mentioned baptism a little earlier, and I was writing about the descent of the Holy Ghost in the Gospels. So that's when Christ's ministry starts. So it's an opening of the sort that you described. It's an opening to possession by this ultimate ineffability. And there's a consequence of that, and that's the descent of the Holy Spirit. And so that descent, we talked earlier about, and you helped me characterize too, in different language, what that ineffable spirit, how it might make itself manifest. I talked about the interplay between conscious and calling, and you talked about love, and you talked about the axiological, and there was one other dimension.
The soteriological, the transformative, the healing.
Right. Okay, so imagine now you open yourself up to that. Okay, so that's when Christ's ministry starts, but here's something very interesting and weird, and I'm interested in your take on this. As soon as the baptism ends, Christ goes into the desert.
Yes.
Okay, so now what that indicates is a radical transformation of personality. So what was there before has, I wouldn't say, it's been supplanted, but that leaves a desert emptiness. That's a good way of thinking about it now. So Christ goes out into the desert. It's like the Israelites leaving
The 40
the
nights,
pharaonic
40 days, yeah, 40
tyranny.
days, yeah.
Okay, so now he's in the desert, and that parallels the Israelite desert. And then he goes to the bottom of things. So you can imagine this is a colloquy with conscience. That's a good way of thinking about it. So imagine that you did something wrong, and you decided that you were going to delve into the depths to understand exactly why it was that you set yourself up for that, and that you were willing to go wherever the Spirit called you to delve into the understructure of that error. So I think that's what happens. I think that's what's being presented in the sequence of temptations that arises in the desert. So you imagine you go into the landscape of the soul, and then you go down the dependency hierarchy to the point from which evil emerges. That's a good way of thinking about it. It parallels the notion in Dante's Inferno,
Yes.
right? Because Dante's Inferno is a set of concentric
I'm reading
circles.
the Inferno.
What's that?
I'm reading the Inferno.
Oh, yeah, okay. So it's a journey. So my sense with the Inferno is you could take any given proximal and trivial sin and delve into it and end up at the bottom. And what Dante presents is that the meta sin, the sin upon which all others emerges, is something like betrayal, right? Because it violates trust.
Yeah, I mean,
I've called betrayal in before the second shadow, and there is a sense in which, so let's imagine that the first shadow is composed of violations against secular and material entities in your day-to-day life, so stealing, lying, that kind of thing. And what do all of these things have in common in terms of violating trust? This is getting into what I did when I did my demonological research several years ago. What do these things have in common? Is that they all imply that the person doing them has no faith that the world cares about them, because they have to fend for themselves. So it's, in a sense, they are, instead of being in relationship with the world and trusting the world, they hate the world, or they are afraid of the world, or they feel other to the world, and they feel compelled to steal and take from things. And this gets reconciled by relationship to the conscience that he's referring to, through that dialogical relationship between your conscience and your calling that he's referring to, expressed in the entities of Jupiter and Saturn, which are a pair of opposites. Now, what John Vervaeke is describing is this sense of non-being, which is something that goes beyond that. This is something that you cannot actually attain the state of non-being until you develop a sense of trust in reality, because what will happen is when you meditate and you try to get to the bottom of things, to reach beyond the material or the category system, you will be flooded by regrets and memories and stresses that you have because you do not trust the world. So this is truly fascinating stuff that these people have come to such parallel conclusions.
For me, it's betrayal, but of the ultimate that is also idolatry, because all of the sins are versions of idolatry, about loving something in place of loving God.
Right.
Right.
That's a Tower of Babel problem too.
Yes. Yes. Right. And so, and this is Tillich's notion. Tillich's notion is what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring an ultimate concern to and have it properly conform to what is most ultimate. And this is the quest for the God beyond the God of theism. But I see that tunneling down. I mean, that I do other practices. I do a spiritual alchemy practice in which you try to recall moments of profound hurt and humiliation, because those are the moments where you get the falsification of the pretentious projections that you make. The pretensions to know and to control both within and without. And in those moments of hurt and humiliation...
So indicate profound indications of error and presumption.
Yes, exactly. So they remove the they give you... Now, what you try to do is you try to bring agape to bear on them, neither pride nor guilt, so that you can you can turn away from the supersalience of the pain and get the
And the
revelation.
humiliation.
Right, and get the revelation, though, of, but look, there's an aperture here. There's a glimpse of how
Right,
things
right.
are outside of the pretext and the presumption. And then what you're trying to do is smelt that and bring
See,
that
I
in.
think that's the same thing as the father who's trapped in the belly of the beast.
Oh, I think so. And
This happens to Jonah, when Jonah descends into the depths. And the consequence of that is his radical revaluation of his ethical stance and his reemergence as a prophet, right? But he goes all the way down to the bottom of things. He does that, interestingly enough, because he tries to escape both his calling and his conscience.
yes.
Right? Because God tells him to do something stupidly impossible and dangerous, and he basically says, hey, I don't think so.
I've always been fascinated by that story. Of course, Melville makes a lot of it in Moby Dick. There's a moment in that story that I find particularly compelling. And one of the things I like about the Bible is that it will have these little moments of very powerful humanity in the midst of wrestling with the numinous. If you remember the story, they come to Jonah, the sailors, and say, what's going on? And he says, well, blah, 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 and God's punishing me. And they don't immediately throw him overboard.
Right.
They go back and they try to save his life.
Save him. Yeah.
And I thought,
Kidding.
What's going on there? That's such a powerful moment. And for me,
They only throw him overboard when there's nothing left to do.
they try everything they can. They exhaust their human capacity in the pursuit of this stranger.
Yeah.
Right? And it's
Guilty stranger.
Yes.
By his own admission.
right. And it would be so easy to be self-righteous.
Yeah.
And just
And
he's
fun.
and throw him overboard and witness the miracle. And they put all of that aside for this. And it's often for me. I mean, I am often like everyone else. I mean, especially coming through the Christmas season, I'm impressed by the impressive moments of the Bible. But even that, I mean, you think about Elijah right after he has he defeats the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and the fire from heaven and then he flees into the desert, and then God, says, "Come, I'm going to show you something." And there's the big fire, and God's not in the fire, and the big wind, and God's
not in the wind.
earthquake.
That's conscience there, right?
Right.
The still small voice within.
Or it sometimes even it's also can be translated as a sheer silence. It's like it can be translated that way also in the Hebrew, and so it's almost like what we were talking about before, that I love this idea of the sheer silence because it's the ineffable, but not as negativity, but as superlative, as that which is calling you. Because what does he do? He covers his face in the, right? He beholds these.
Do you think there's any difference between the valid voice of conscience and the voice of the ineffable? I mean, if the ineffable is the foundation, and if conscience is a sign of transgression against it, then those things should be related.
Well, see, here's the problem, and this is the problem that goes back that I have with Descartes. Descartes, I mean, and this is a standard philosophical trope, so I'm not claiming any originality here. But Descartes seems to get bunged up on the difference between a psychological and logical indubitability, right? He gets the things that he can't doubt, and he then concludes that they're ontologically certain. And of course, our inability to doubt can be driven by many things other than metaphysical necessity. They can be driven by all kinds of psychological issues, self-deception issues, failures.
Demons of various sorts.
Yeah, yes. And of course, everybody made continual philosophical hay out of that. And I worry also, because this comes up in Plato's privet problem about what actually turns people towards the good because of the problem of Alcibiades. And I don't trust any, maybe let me try a different word. I don't idolize any one of my faculties. I think my conscience can also be something that was driven into me, perhaps by aspects of my culture, my parents.
That's the pathological superego problem.
So, okay, there's a couple things that I want to reference here. He was talking about the idea of conscience. We've already sort of named conscience as this dynamic interplay between the concept of Jupiter or positive culture and the concept of Saturn, negative culture or authoritarian culture. But also these two things, they have their good and bad sides respectively. Saturn being order and organization, Jupiter being enthusiasm, zealotry, and over, like, what I mean by enthusiasm is you're so enthusiastic that you skip down the garden path into danger. Um, and delusion would be another way. Optimistic delusion is another way of saying that. And or failure to be cynical enough. And then we've talked about the idea of K2. So he's talking about conscience, which is this Jupiter-Saturn thing. And then he said the sheer silence. Remember, what did I say it was the sheer silence? The sheer silence is represented by this Hindu figure of Ketu, which is a body with no head. It's senseless. It's in the good way. It has no senses. It cannot impose false categories. And its dialogical counterpart is Rahu, which is represented by a head with no body. It has all of the senses available to it, which are stored obviously in the head, but it's unable to feel them, really, to access them. So it's this mind-body problem that people often talk about. And so right now they're linking in a sort of alchemical dialogue these two oppositions, the opposition of Jupiter and Saturn, conscience and calling, and the opposition of this sheer silence with the illusion of category structure, Rahu and Ketu. So just bear that in mind as we're moving forward. And they also were referencing Descartes. And Descartes, I feel, is very much a head-based thinker rather than a body-based thinker. And that's the take I get of him, is that he says, I think, therefore I am. And that implies too much faith in the logical faculties. The logical faculties, as John Vervaeke just said, can be misled. They can be confused. Even your conscience and your calling can be errant, which actually means that they violate, in addition to being divisible, because they're related, they're the dialogical interplay between these two entities, they're also errant. And what are the three classical attributes of God? All-powerful, indivisible, all-loving. I believe there's four, actually. And inerrant. So all-powerful would be something like inerrant. So yeah, so they're already, these faculties are divisible and errant. Not to say that they can't grow, but if you can grow, you're automatically you have problems. So this is another reason why I'm opposed to the concept of monotheism.
And I suffer from a sadistic superego in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so...
See, in Pinocchio, the puppet has to establish a relationship with the conscience, and it transforms as well.
Yes.
Right? So it's not an unerring divine voice from the outset. It's something like a generic approximation that can err, and a tyrannical great father within would be an example of that.
Right, and I think part of the Socratic project and how it's unfolded for me, often in a psychologically startling way, is to try and enter into a dialogical relationship with my conscience, with my consciousness, with my character.
All right, I'm going to call this here. You can go check out the full video on Jordan Peterson's channel. It is very, very good. I recommend watching the whole thing, but I've been going for nearly 70 minutes now, so I'm going to call it. But I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think below. I'm a really big fan of these guys. I can't stress that enough. To the extent that I'm critical of them, it's only to better their development, and these guys they make me very happy that these people exist. They restore a bit of my faith in humanity. So all contradictions that I point out or criticisms that I give are done with immense respect, immense gratitude, and only for the purpose of their continual growth and productivity in their journeys, wherever those may take them. Till next time.